Hello and welcome back. It's so great to see everybody. Come on in, sit down. I hope you got some good tea and coffee, courtesy of Cat and Cloud. We're so happy to see everybody still coming back. We actually sold out the tickets for this event. So that's great as long as everybody doesn't come all at the same time. You know, so we do have an overflow space back there if we need it, but right now it seems like, you know, people are not coming all at the same time, which is great. I expect more people will show up as we get closer to the evening, but they're going to miss this next part, which is what I've been really looking forward to among all the things this weekend. A few months ago, several months ago, I was listening to NPR. And on comes this article, or this story, about a collective based in San Francisco at one time, right? Yeah, one time based in San Francisco, now Oakland. National.
More Oakland, but...
More Oakland, yeah. Oakland, yeah, absolutely, Oakland. Now more national, of a group of women, African-American women, who were particularly interested in engaging deeply with pop culture and fantasy and science fiction. And we were so moved and excited by this, I said to myself, as I was listening, I said, I wonder if we can get them to come to the Festival of Monsters. And immediately after that, my phone started blowing up. And Camila and a whole bunch of other people in my friend group were saying, you should get them for Festival of Monsters! So I said, well, we'll try. So I went to the website and I emailed them, and they responded back in a very positive way, and they are here today, and I am so excited about this. So I'm really geeking out about you geeks being here to geek out with us. So it's so exciting. So I'll let them introduce themselves, but I'm going to introduce the interlocutor for this event, which is Dr. Camila Hawthorne, who is in social sciences in, I've forgotten, geography.
Sociology.
I'm a
geographer by training. Geography has my heart, but I'm into sociology.
Sociology at UC Santa Cruz, and a proud member of the Center for Monster Studies. So I will just turn it over. Take it away, Camila. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I feel like if you look at my CV, I have a million different affiliations at UC Santa Cruz, but my absolute favorite is being a faculty affiliate of the UCSC Center for Monster Studies, because then I tell friends that I'm an affiliate of a Center for Monster Studies, and then they think that I'm some kind of a Professor Van Helsing, so it's very cool. So welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you all here today and to meet in person, since we've been talking by email for several months. So I thought that we could start by just, say your names and your favorite scary season film, movie, comic character, and then we'll get into the story of Black Nerds Create.
Cool. Hi, I'm Bayana, co-founder of Black Nerds Create, and I'm very, I scare easily, but I would say I wore my Thriller shirt. Like, Thriller is it's like very formative for me. I remember being terrified watching it, but still through my fingers, still wanting to watch it. So I'm gonna have to go with Thriller.
I'm Robyn Jordan. I'm also co-founder of Black Nerds Create, and as we were doing this, I'm probably scarier than you. Yeah. I don't even just walking in here with the mask, I was like, I made a mistake. So I'm stealing Bayana's answer. It's not Thriller, though. It's actually Michael Jackson's Ghost, because then when he dances as a skeleton, it's like a joyful horror, I guess. So that's gonna be my answer.
Hi, I'm Porshea Patterson-Hurst, she, her. I'm Chief Experience Officer for Black Nerds Create, and I really enjoy horror. I've only recently gotten more into it. I don't like gory parts, so if you ask me about stuff that's gory, I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't know it. But I do know more fun things. I don't have a big major monster, except for I love the dark and ghost type Pokemon. So if we're gonna do running through the wild area and the ghosts are chasing you, I love that moment and experience. It's so fun. So that would be my thing, is the ghost Pokemon run, wild ride on your bike in the wild area of Pokemon.
Didn't even know Pokemon had ghosts.
Yeah.
I'm so glad to know that I'm, not the only baby at the table who doesn't have the strongest appetite for horror. I'm literally the MC of a Halloween circus show over the next few weeks, and some of the acts scare me, and I'm on stage watching them, and I'm literally terrified, and then I can't go backstage in the dark. So it's good to know that I'm not alone. So now I'd love to get into the story of Black Nerds Create. Again, when Michael raised the possibility of bringing you all here for Monster Fest, I was so excited because I grew up as a Black nerd watching Star Trek with my dad, really into Man McCaffrey, wishing that I'm still a dragon nerd at heart,
Yes.
right? I wish that I could ride my own dragon rider. I wish that I could be a dragon rider. And at the same time, there's a particular complexity, ambiguity to being a Black person in these fandom spaces. And I think one of the first things that we talked about when we hopped on Zoom together was this question of what it means to love things that also hurt us. And so there's a few parts to this question, but one, if you could just tell a little bit of the story of how Black Girls Create and then Black Nerds Create came into being. But then also more broadly, why is it so important to create these Black spaces within the world of fandom? And, how do you sort of think about the challenges and possibilities that are precisely at this really ambiguous intersection of, despair and hope in being a Black fan?
Yeah, okay. So Robyn and I are cousins, like blood related, and now it's been a while. It's been a long time. 8-ish years ago, I wanted to do, I think I was just online more. I was kind of like, I'd always been a nerd, but hadn't really thought about it in any like real sense. It was just like, I like to read a lot. I like, superheroes and like magic and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of wanted a place to talk about that and explore that a little bit, but I'm very shy. I did not want to do that by myself, so I like called Robyn and was like, do you want to start a blog with me and we can talk about being nerds? And she was like, sure, whatever. And like then in the like 8 years since, we've kind of, I don't know, none of it happened by accident, but it definitely wasn't anything that we like expected when we first started. We had the blog for a while, we were doing a podcast, and then we started, at some point we realized like, okay, the blog's not working. We did 2 posts a week. Each of us did a post a week, and after like a couple years we realized like, okay, I think we've run through all of the topics that we have to like talk about. So yeah, we just got more into podcasting, like creating content in other ways. And as we did that, we just started like finding friends and like holding on to them. So Porshea is one of those people who like pretty early on was like, hey, I'm around and like, I like to read books. I want to do book reviews. We're like, great, you're coming with us. And so it just kind of grew from there. We're at about, I think it's 7 of us at this point. And yeah, it's just kind of, it's just going.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good, accurate description of how we came to be. I didn't think I even was diagnosed at the time, but I have wild ADHD, like insane. And so I was like, yeah, sure, cool, because I'm impulsive and I don't think things through. And I also was helping out with a podcasting company, and I was like, but if we do this, then you have to do this Harry Potter podcast with me, because I need to prove someone wrong. They basically did it out of spite. So it was like no one cares about Harry Potter anymore, and I was like, little do you know. And then
8 years later.
8 years later, right? And then like as we got further and further along with like podcasting and moving past Harry Potter, thank God. I started to think through also like a lot of the things that I like, and this kind of goes back to the other part of this question. I'm hyperfixated on the NSYNC reunion, which is very important to me. So if I bring it up, I'm sorry, but that's all I've thought about for the past like month and a half. But I'm also really into cozy fantasy right now, because like I said, I'm a very scary person. I don't like things, and the world has high enough stakes as it is, and so these like stories in which like an orc opens up a coffee shop and gently falls in love is just like really just like soothing my soul right now. But it is also like hard to find those spaces where you fit in there, when you see yourself in them. So yeah, I just think that like it's really important sometimes to be able to shut that side of your brain off. But a big component of a lot of fantasy stories, they take from real world dynamics, and so it's very hard to read about like these epic journeys or these good versus evil fights, and then the evil thing is very obviously a stand-in for like your entire culture and backstory, and being like, well, that's wildly offensive and wrong. So we thought, as well as just wanting to like talk more about the things that we're into, like we wanted to really delve deep into what it means to be a critical fan, and to like say, yeah, I love these things, but I'm also not blind to their faults and not blind to the narratives that like permeate our society through these stories that we love. And at the same time, kind of challenging people, like as a person of color, as a woman of color, I am expected to find myself in these stories that do not look like me and were not written with me in mind, and I'm expected to find something to hold on to. And we don't have that same expectation for the majority, like, Dominant, thank you. I'm like, they're not the majority. The dominant classes, and so it's like, it's very important to build empathy through getting to know other people's worldviews, but also it's very easy to build empathy if you just set yourself aside, or find the things that like, find the places in which you do see the commonalities. There's this like quote from one of the characters in Moonlight, it's one of my favorite quotes, of like, Moonlight, the movie, tells a story that's so specific, but in that specificity you find the like, the universal. Thank you. I've said this quote like 1,000 times, I don't know why, I need more coffee. But yeah, so I think that that was another thing that we thought about when, not just starting BNC, but like in our journey through growing and getting more and bigger and bringing people in, is like also making sure that they are interested in like really challenging these narratives, but also finding joy in them as well. Like, no one wants to, you know, spend their time hating on media that they, like, you know, it's not fun. So, I mean, it's a big reason why we just, like, stopped with Harry Potter, because after a while it was like, I'm not enjoying this, and, like, and it's not good. Like, the new stuff is not good, but, like, I'm also just not enjoying this, and why am I spending the, you know, small amount of time that I have slogging through something that I don't enjoy. But, yeah, that's it. I'm rambling now.
And I'll just add that I got into the creative initially because I heard these wonderful voices talking about a fandom that I had gone through my life thinking I was like a fan of one, like just like I grew up in a
Fandom adjacent.
Right. I grew up in a primarily like white suburban town in Tennessee. So like I had a couple of friends who were into Harry Potter, but like they would go to like midnight showings of the movie or like go pick up the book, but then I was not going with them. Like I wouldn't know that they were going to go do that, so I would just go do it on the side by myself. And so hearing like someone who had similar viewpoints and perspectives that I had, reading the books, being like, my mother would never. Like those kind of moments. It was so great to have that reaffirmed and hearing them. So I think as we've grown out the collective, we've had a really big eye towards how do we make it so that like even when we're looking at these franchises and forms of like media, that we're bringing out a perspective that's actually able to help other people kind of, even if they're not represented in the story well, maybe they can interact with people who are like pointing that out and are talking about it, and we can kind of like have a bigger, grander discussion. So I think that the fandom part of it is like a part we keep wrestling with of like, how big of fans are we, like how much we want to promote around being fans, and how much we want it to be community-lended. And I feel like a big portion of our community came from the same space that I came from, of feeling like at some point they were just fandom fans alone, and now they've been able to come into our community and be like, oh, we're just going to be fans together. So that's been a really great aspect of our work that we've done as a collective, is even if like one person in our community is like watching a random show, like they might get to pull a few people in there, and then we're like, now there's suddenly like a whole space for people to talk about the thing. So I feel like that's been the greater kind of like value that we've gotten out of the work too, which is providing the space for people to come together and like enjoy a thing together.
Yeah, and I think just one other thing we haven't touched on yet is, so like Robyn mentioned critical fandom, we also practice creative fandom, which is like where the create part comes in our name. Because one of the things that we think about a lot is like, you can be critical of the thing that you love, you can talk about it, have those conversations, but then like what comes after that? And so for us, we think a lot about like making your own things, and whether that's like fan fiction or something that's like directly tied to that property, or then, you know, becoming inspired to make your own thing. That's something that we do a lot, especially in our community. Like we have designated times for folks to come together and create together. We have this whole, like we are in Discord, so we have a channel where it's like, oh, I'm doing this thing, or I've done this thing, and everyone will like very aggressively give you love for that thing that you're doing. So we also like build that into it as well, because we don't want it to just be like, okay, yeah, we're here, we're talking about stuff, but we also want it to be a place where you also like share the things that you care about and that you're creating and that you're kind of doing for yourself. And also in doing that, inspiring folks who maybe didn't think of themselves as creators or as people who were going to make their own thing or get into some hobby, just inspire them to do it and know that they can come and share that in our space, and that they're going to get a bunch of people like shouting at them about how great that is. So yeah.
It's very common to be in our community and be like, I have thoughts on this thing that I watch, and then it devolve into like 15 people yelling, you make that, write that, do that.
Or you're minding your business and somebody finds something on your social media and is like, look what they're doing. And you're like, oh, I didn't mean to catch a stray. Like, I'm fine. It's like very...
We even have some people now that charge each other. They're like, oh, I can't do the thing. And they're like, you owe me $1. And it's like, oh, okay.
I'd rather do the thing now than pay you back. So that's, yeah it's very...
It's love bullying. Bullying works, especially out of love.
Oh, thank you. This is so fantastic. And I love that, you know, you've talked about one, you know, there's so many questions of representation that are tied up with the work that you do. And one is, you know, feeling represented in fandom and, you know, being surrounded by, you know, other Black folk who, you know, experience, again, the feelings of excitement and joy, but also ambiguity and the questioning, and to be able to create those spaces together, which, you know, I also grew up in a predominantly white community, had a very similar experience, right, of, you know, then the white kids say, oh, well, you're not really Black because you like these things, and you're like, since when does liking, I mean, have you all heard of MF Doom, or like I mean, there's, you know, the list could go on and on and on, all, you know, all of Afrofuturism, this idea that Blackness and nerdery and fandom are somehow mutually exclusive. But, you know, to really create those spaces and build them is so important. I want to talk about another aspect of representation, which is sort of representation in the characters themselves. And, you know, as you know, there's been so much conversation and also violent backlash happening in the worlds of sci-fi and fantasy around questions of representation. This fall, I'm teaching an undergraduate senior seminar called Black Geographies in the Imperative of Abolition, which is about questions of policing in prison. And whenever I teach this class in the first week, we don't start by reading academic reports. We don't start by reading policy reports about police reform. We start by reading speculative fiction. We read Ursula Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and we read N.K. Jemison's The Ones Who Stay and Fight. And then we read some work by Adrienne Marie Brown on speculative fiction. And I also have them watch N.K. Jemison's, I believe it was her 2018 Hugo Award speech, when she won the Hugo Award for Best Novel 3 years in a row for every book in the Broken Earth trilogy, which is such a flex.
I stand.
And, you know, she gave this I've watched this video more times than I can count, and every time I watch it, I get goosebumps because she talks about the power of representation. So I want to start by just asking, right now in sort of the pop culture landscape, who are some of your characters to, watch or read and think with in this moment?
Bree Matthews.
Yeah, okay. So Robyn mentioned the podcast that we started way back when, that originally was Harry Potter focused. We deaded that 2 years ago, I think. And then last year we rebooted the podcast to focus on Black fantasy stories written by Black authors. So it's called Wizard Team. And we read Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Alston. It's a middle grade fantasy. Will be a trilogy, but the first 2 books are out right now. And it's so good. Amari is such a great, she's this 12-year-old who goes into this, it's like...
Men in Black.
It's Men in Black. It's basically Men in Black. She ends up in this summer camp that turns into her learning how to do, it's like Men in Black. It's hard
agents
to...
and there's a supernatural world, and she's doing this Department of Supernatural Investigations.
Right. So she's meeting all these different magical creatures, and then finds out that she's a magician, and figuring out what that means in her world.
And it's legal to be a magician in that world.
Right. So there's that, and then more recently we're reading Legend Born by Tracy Dion, which is a YA novel about a teenage girl. Her name is Bree, who goes to early college at UNC Chapel Hill. Her mother has just passed away. She encounters this magical secret society.
Cult.
It's a cult, but it's a magical secret society that are descendants of the Knights of the Round Table. And so she has to infiltrate it to figure out the mystery of her mother's death. It's really good. Y'all should read both of those books. But the 3 of us are hosts of that podcast, and so those have been, I think, right now the most top of mind because of the ways that they move through the world as Black girls, but then on top of that there's that added, so for Amari, she's a magician. It's illegal in this world to be a magician, so she has to constantly prove herself and show that she can be good, because all the other magicians and examples that they have were evil or turned evil in some kind of way. And so this added thing of her being Black, a girl, and then also a magician, and then Bree also similarly is in the South and in this secret society that is predominantly white. She has yet to meet another Black person so far in where we are in the book who is in this secret society, and so she's constantly being told and shown that she doesn't belong there for a lot of different reasons, but also very primarily because she's this Black girl who just popped up out of nowhere and decided she wanted to pledge. And so in that, I think we think a lot about I guess who decides who are the monsters, and what that means for those people when they're trying to navigate the spaces that they're
Also,
in for whatever reasons that they're in them.
Especially with Amari, I would say another big kind of thing that jumps out about those books to me is if you're always told you're bad and society is set up to make you a crime, even if you have no control over who you are, and all of the systems are set up to make you a criminal, and there are no resources, no help, you are just immediately thought of and pushed aside and labeled as criminal and wrong and evil, then what choices do you have? But also, how do you prove a negative? And also, if you are not given a place in society, how do you survive, right? So if I can't openly live in this society and take care of myself or find the resources that I need to live, then everything that I do is illegal. And then at what point does that illegality not matter anymore? And at what point do I then confirm your things because you've pushed me into a corner so far that I don't have any choice if I want to survive? So I think these stories and they're told in a much better way than that sounded. They're very also very whimsical, and they find joy and things like that. But these stories also, yes, who decides who are monsters, but also what choices are you giving monsters to be anything but?
A monster.
So I think that's important too.
And then, I'm sorry, but I read a lot. So
We all read a lot, and then we all read a lot, and then Portia's like,
I got so excited last year because I hit 100 books, and then Portia was like, hold my back.
Yeah, so I read a lot, and as I've said, I've gotten slightly more into horror. So I'm gonna just note some of the things that I've read recently that I think were good fits. There's a YA that came out this year. It's called I Feed the Beast and the Beast is Me. And it is, it's she is a ballerina. She's American, but she's an expat. Her family's lived in France for a long time, and she's competing for this very hard spot. And it's queer, and it's, she is not trying to be a likable character. She's trying to get hers, and she's trying to be as cutthroat as everyone around her. And I love characters who are not trying to, especially whenever you're a Black woman, you have to perform gentleness to get around the whole strength and that kind of part of yourself. And she's not trying to perform gentleness at all. And I love that. And then my favorite horror is gothic horror. And historical fiction is my jam anyways, but gothic horror just kind of hits all those notes. And one of the things that I read recently that fits in that realm is Sylvia Moreno Garcia's Daughter of Dr. Moreau, where there are monsters in there, and it kind of twists that classic Dr. Moreau tale and makes it more about the horrors of colonization in Mexico, and it's a really cool story. So if I were to suggest anything that's has a slight horror focus, I would give those two as things that I've been into recently and has stuck with me. And those characters are kind of morally gray, and they're trying to figure things out. And on morally gray characters to watch, I loved Arcane. I loved that there was such a dynamic in character representation within that story, and I'd really recommend Arcane. Never been into League of Legends, but somehow I'm do I care about League of Legends now? It's so good.
Thank you. I could take up the rest of the time just talking about all of my favorite characters right now, but I will spare you. So we know that representation matters, and we hear that refrain a lot, and of course it certainly does. But my next question is representation alone enough? And what might be the problems of only focusing on representation as kind of the end goal of what we're organizing around as Black fans in this world? What else is needed alongside more expansive representations?
I feel like I went first.
Okay, so I think representation is not enough. I think that there's also, I go back to this a lot. I'm a community manager by career, and a large part of my job is just empathy and explaining empathy to corporations, but also just people who build things. I think about this all the time. I am very anti-robot, AI, anything like that. So this is one of those strange things where I think about this, but I also don't want it fixed. If you go to a public restroom and you try to wash your hands as a Black person, you'll see Black people shoving their hands because they're not programmed to recognize our skin. I personally am fine with that. Please don't fix it. Because I think that
Don't recognize us.
Don't recognize us, because when they come for you, I will be hiding in the corner and they will not see me. And that is fine by me. But I think there is also this idea of, representation means that we see people in our world, but there is never a moment in which it's why don't you see yourself in our world? Why don't you, as a marginalized person, it is imperative, it is life, threatening if you do not understand the world in which you're living in and all of the perils. This is totally not monster related, but Jamie Foxx put something on Instagram about how if they will kill Jesus, they'll come after you. And it blew up because apparently that, in certain circles, is an anti-Semitic statement. I found out that that was an anti-Semitic statement the same time Jamie Foxx did, I assume, and the rest of like Black America. And we were like, no, that just means that you're like,
People
and your friends will betray you. It means like, and I was like, and everyone's like, well, everyone says the Jews killed Jesus, and I was like, but the Romans killed Jesus, and I grew up in the Black church, and so I was like,
Philistines and,
the Philistines, and and it's like, and like the people that like, you know, sorry, Judas betrayed, you know, whatever. But this is like what I grew up learning, and like this is what we learn at Vacation Bible School. This is a saying that is said in Black churches and in Black families, even if you're not that religious.
know of it.
Yeah, you know of it, but you also like don't think about it in that way, right? But then you find out like, oh no, this is also being told to people in a very anti-Semitic way. And what I thought was like a really interesting moment of like, oh, we all live in the same country, but we don't all live in the same country, and we speak the same language, but we don't speak the same language, became a like very combative and people being very defensive, and like, you know, I feel like it was a moment where you really start to think through, one, like, we don't know the roots of everyone's, like, or where everyone's coming from, but also, like, how important it is to understand those things when miscommunication happens and to come from a place of learning. Like, oh, I just learned something new, and like, oh, I won't say that, or I might continue to say that, but make sure that I give context around it, or make sure that they understand that that's not, you know, when I say this phrase, I mean it in this way, or whatever. I thought that was like a really beautiful moment in which we all, as Americans, could have like been like, oh, we're learning something new about each other. And then I remembered that we live in America, and so that's not how that works. But what I mean to say by that is like, representation will only get you so far if you are not interested in learning what those people go through, what their lives are like, how they convene, how they interact, engage with not only the dominant class, but with each other. And so I would like to see a lot more stories that are mass marketed, where it's not a fish out of water. It's not, I'm infiltrating this dominant class. It's basically like me in my community, living life, going on adventures, and I want to see other people reading those. I spent my entire childhood obsessed with a wizard boy from England who got on a train. I didn't even know that like houses are actually a thing in English like school. Like I went and I was like, oh no,
Private schools.
Private schools. Yeah, but prefects, I thought that was something J.K. Rowling made up. And then I was like, oh no, there are prefects in the world. And I was like, that's interesting, that's really great. But like, I would love for that to happen in reverse. And I would love that to happen more often and not be shocking. That was long-winded.
I feel like you covered the whole question.
Yeah, I was
going
gonna say, I feel like you got it.
Nothing to add.
I feel like I could add a little part too, just about representation, and I think like a lot of times it happens all the time with like diversity, inclusion, representation, like all these words that someone comes out with, says very clearly defines, and then it gets co-opted and watered down, and so we get, you know, what is it? The new like Sex and the City or whatever? Don't they have like, now they have like people of color in the background, because back when Sex and the City was first out,
one of them has like a part, like she's like a part of the
right.
main,
And I don't watch this.
Yeah.
I just,
don't watch
you know,
it either. I
I've
just know
gleaned
that
from like scrolling online, right? Like, oh, okay, they added like extras of color. Good for them. But like a lot of times it's stuff like that where you know that they're just like, oh, we just
Check a box.
we threw y'all in there, cool. Now we're done. We can escape that like discourse or whatever. Versus stories that really take the time to, I mean, okay, so there's this thing about like colorblind casting versus color conscious casting. And so the idea that like if you're going, like you might have written this character and you didn't have like a Black person in mind for them, right? And like you could find someone and you're like, oh no, they're perfect, and you put them there and then just go with the script that you have, or you find that person, you cast them, and then you're like, okay, we have to do rewrites in order to make this feel like an authentic person. You hire someone who has that like expertise and perspective to really make that character shine in a way that makes sense, right? And like, we can tell when you have done that and when you haven't done that. And so it's just, again, like going deeper into it, not just, oh, we've done this thing, great, like pat ourselves on the back. It's like, no, we put real intention into showing these stories and these different people and in hiring the people who have that knowledge and expertise to make those stories shine in the way that they should.
I was gonna go on a celestive.
Do it.
Okay. I don't know why this wizard boy keeps coming up, but you cannot have a black woman president in the 1920s Harlem wearing a pantsuit and that's just fine, and no one says anything. Like, we couldn't even get Hillary Clinton as president in a pantsuit in 2000. Like, you cannot just cast a black woman and then not think about all of the questions that come up.
I mean, and
all of the questions.
I will say there is stuff. So most recently, I'm the only one here who is very much into Lord of the Rings. Shout out to bro with the ponytail and the orc over there. Love that. Love that. So in Rings of Power, they casted fairly diversely, and so they did okay, I guess. It doesn't. It's like one of those things where if it's not in the our specific world, it's not contemporary, it's high fantasy. You can sometimes get away with more things because there's the idea that oh, it's not set up in the same way, whatever. So they have Queen Miriel, who is Numenorian. They have an elf, Arondir, and they have a dwarf, Disa. They're all great, love them. But again, it kind of just stays there. It's we have them here. That's great. And I think you also then have to think about stereotypes and how you do or don't play into those things. And so you have people say certain things or act in certain ways, and then it can, just having people who can look at how something is written in this very high fantasy, removed from our world lens, but then also remember that the people who are watching it are coming from our world, and so what are they going to think about certain things? What are they going to think about the way that these characters are portrayed? Also, protecting your actors when they are announced as characters in these really high fantasy worlds. It's happened in Star Wars, Game of Thrones, Rings of Power, Star Trek.
Percy Jackson.
Percy Jackson.
Hello. So it's happened time and time again. At this point, we know that if you have a black person or a person of color cast in certain especially established franchises, they need that protection from folks who are racist and are going to be racist trolls and are going to come at them over and over again just on the strength of Halle Bailey when she was cast in Little Mermaid, and they're oh, this is redhead erasure, and I'm she can dye her hair, it's fine. So it's a lot of taking into account the real world, even when the stories that you're telling aren't contemporary.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I particularly love the idea of, thinking about representation or inclusion as not just being included in their world, right, but bringing them into our world. And I think even to take that a step farther to understand how our worlds are interconnected. And I think one piece right now that does that, I think really beautifully, I don't know if anyone is watching Castlevania Nocturne, but it is about the simultaneity of the French and Haitian revolutions. And as a result, the simultaneity of different practices of mysticism and spirituality and sort of these different fantasy worlds, right? So Orishas and Yoruba spirituality alongside, night creatures and vampires in a way that feels incredibly well researched and deeply respectful, and also incredibly painful. It's not easy, right? There's deep violence. It is about racial capitalism and racial capitalism as a form of monstrosity. So, speaking of monsters, Monster Fest happens in October for a reason, right? Halloween season is the perfect time of year to talk about monsters and everything that they represent. And as so many authors have pointed out, and as you also have pointed out in this panel, speculative fiction has always so contrary to, the, angry cishet white men who are like, you're bringing your wokeness into our fantasy. These genres have always been about race, oppression, and colonialism, even when those connections are not made explicit, right? These genres are saturated with themes of oppression, colonization, abduction, enslavement, experimentation. These are like the standard themes of sci-fi and fantasy. And monsters, too, usually tell us something about power relations, about who is considered other, what is considered transgressive in society. And when it comes to blackness, we usually see two types of relationships between blackness and monstrosity play out on our screens or on our pages. On the one hand, black people who are represented as monsters, or monsters who become ways of representing stereotypical blackness. And so we know all that, and so my first question for you is, can we think of other examples of ways that the figure of the monster has been used to call attention to racism without reproducing anti-blackness, especially right now when we're seeing, particularly catalyzed by Jordan Peele, but not exhausted by Jordan Peele's work, this, sort of genre of racial horror?
Yeah, I feel like Get Out is like one of very good about that, of like not reinvigorating like a racist discourse while also like making it very clear and pointed about like what is happening within the story. I'm marinating here on there's so many stories that I've read that have been reconfiguring the idea of like villainy. I love this conversation that I keep seeing about villains who are like the villain, the figure that's called the villain is most likely the one to like take over the world or like doom the world in order to save their love, whereas the hero figure is the one who's most likely to like save the world to their love's doom, and kind of that kind of like playing against each other. And I'm trying to think of some I don't think that there's been a lot of space given to black characters being able to be selfish in that way, of being like, I'm going to doom the world for my love of a particular person or my community. And I guess that's something I would like to see more of, because I haven't seen that as much. I'm like, the speculative fiction that I've seen has been mostly around, and that has had like black community spaces. So like a middle grade that I recently read was Sir Boating, and like I forget what the and the part is, but like the guide to vampire hunting. And so it's that in that world, the vampire hunters are all based within like a West African mythology of like the Ajay, and like that what the vampire life is in there. And they are like they are the villains of the story, but as the more you get involved in the story, you realize there's more going on behind who, like the vampire hunters are black and the vampires are like black. So there's like this really interesting conversation going on around like they're creatures. They're not fully like mortal or like humanized, and yet the person who's controlling them is like a witch, and she has been like, she's like on a revenge mission, and that has been really interesting to me. Like it's actually able to steep itself in West African, like I think it's Ghanaian primarily mythology, and still have this conversation about control, using your like community and like going against your community, but also your community has wronged you, and so what do you do in those stances? And I like those more nuanced takes on stories, like what do you do when you've been forsaken, and like you're like the main character is a young girl who doesn't know the background about why this person feels like they're getting revengeance, and so I really enjoy that kind of lens of like, we've been told our whole lives what a hero archetype is and what a villain archetype is, but it's not until you get older and until you get to learn the nuances between things where you start questioning that more. And I like that more media is actually picking up on the nuanced takes now. I really have been enjoying that, and I feel like that's like been a good example for me so far.
Yeah, that one's by Roseanne Brown. She also has a duology, it's young adult, A Song of Wraiths and Ruin, and the female main character in that book is also kind of like wrangles with like being unlikable and being selfish and like having that be okay. Yeah, and then that also made me think of The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna, where they, in this society, if you're a girl and born with gold blood, you're considered a monster, and you're taken to this it's like a you kind of are forced to become a soldier to then like fight these monsters called death streaks, and they're like horrific. And so like, but you follow this girl Deka who finds out she has gold blood and ends up in this place, and then as she's fighting these monsters starts to kind of, I don't want to spoil it, but she kind of like then has to confront what the death streaks are, where they come from, like what that means for her, like finding that humanity in those creatures, and then kind of digging deeper into this like oppressive society that she's being forced to fight for. And it's one of my favorite series. But yeah. I don't know if you have
I
others.
actively do not read about monsters. I did recently read, I cannot remember the name of it, something about the Inner Flame, the Temple of the Inner Flame. It was a Kindle Unlimited, so, that's where I'm at. Not that there's anything, I've read some great Kindle Unlimited books, but she is a necromancer, and I did enjoy the relationship that she has with the dead, though one of the things about her gift is that for certain people, if they spend any significant time with her, they start to die. And so there are certain people that they don't understand it yet, and some people have an immunity to it, but she gets married, falls in love, the person that she's in love with has an immunity, they have a baby. And normally with necromancers, the babies are immune, but she's slowly making her baby sick and dying, and so she leaves and abandons, but not really, her husband and child to make sure that they're safe. And I like the idea of her grappling with seeing herself as a monster, but also like, what is that? There is no bigger sacrifice than like, separating yourself from your child and the person that you love to make sure that they are okay and that they live a healthy life. And so I thought it was a really interesting thing where it's kind of like your gift is also your curse. And it's a series I haven't finished yet, but apparently she needs to kind of find her ancestors, or the correct ancestors, to give her to like better understand her gift, and then hopefully she'll be able to reunite with her family. But I like that idea of I've just been really loving anything where you kind of, death is not the end, and you're able to kind of understand and talk to your ancestors or other people beyond like the veil of death, but also that sense of, like you said, like selfishness and like where are the limits to that? So I haven't finished the series, it's a trilogy, but yeah. Otherwise I don't go for monsters at all.
Well, I mean, I think for me, I'm definitely going to continue, thinking with this question of how we might be able to imagine monstrosity outside of this lens that's informed by, capitalist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchal culture. And the other thing that it's making me think of is also the way that we're seeing these new works that are playing with the genre of Lovecraftian horror in ways that would have horrified Lovecraft in like the best way possible, right? Because deep down, right, for Lovecraft, like the true horror was a kind of racial horror, racial terror. So we see this with Lovecraft Country, we see this with N.K. Jemisin's The City We Became. But I want to sort of end with one last question for you before we open it up to questions of the audience, and in part because I'm staring down this orc right here. And I know Michael Chemers and I have talked a lot about orcs, and there's, in these communities, there's a lot of debate about what we do with orcs, right? James Mendez Hodas says, maybe we actually can sort of reclaim the figure of the orc. N.K. Jemisin has said that she basically wants nothing to do with orcs. I'm also thinking about the fact that, in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, right, all of the Maori actors, this was filmed in New Zealand, all of the Maori actors were cast as orcs, right? What do we do with orcs?
I feel like I will say, like, with Rings of Power, I know that they didn't really go all the way in. I think the way that they should have, they tried to, they have a character, Adar, I think. It's been a minute since I've watched, but they tried to make this character who is dark elf, and is one of the, I guess, fathers of the orcs or whatever. They tried to give him more sympathy, I guess. But in doing so, they kind of messed up Galadriel's character in a way, and then didn't really push it forward. They didn't really interrogate it, I don't think, the way that they started to. And so I think that that's kind of the problem, right? Is when you have these things and you realize ooh, that's not great, but what am I gonna do with it? Is you really have to go all the way in on interrogating it if you're going to do that. And if not, then just leave it alone, because it's not really worth it to just kind of introduce it and then be oh, never mind, we're good, they're still evil. Let's move on with the plot. So yeah, I think it's complicated, and it really depends on your intention as you're doing it, and how deep are you willing to go, really.
Yeah, I also think too, it's important sometimes to really go back and think about what was the purpose of the orc, right? And that's one of the things that N.K. Jemisin talks about so nicely, is the purpose was to have this stand-in for blackness in a really racialized and stereotypical and violent way. I recently read Legends and Lattes. I don't know, it's the big cozy fantasy book of whatever, and the orc retires and opens a coffee shop in a place where people don't really understand what coffee is. And I did not realize, and this is a part of failure of, I think a pretty good failure of my education, I guess, in a sense. I did not read Lord of the Rings on purpose and refuse to still. But I didn't realize the historical significance of orcs until later in life, when I wasn't also actively reading a lot about orcs. And so I read this book. I don't know the race of the author, but it's man. And considering that publishing is 80% white, I'm just assuming that he's a white man. But I thought oh, it's nice that they're softening this creature that's thought of as just there for battle and bloodshed, and she's really into coffee, which I'm really into coffee, and so I think that that's a cool thing. But then digging deeper, it's so we're rehabbing or trying to rehab the inner lives of orcs, but for what purpose? Could we have not made a new mythical creature who retires, and then because then it's okay, so are orcs just good for bloodshed until they one day get tired of it and then they want to go start a coffee shop? What if they never wanted bloodshed? I think that's one thing that, I guess it depends on the person and the creator, but I always think if you go back into what was the purpose of this, is rehab necessary, or is it just good to just give it up? I don't know the answer, but.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna just flip this question, because as I have read Lord of the Rings through once, and that was enough for me. I the orcs did not stick with me. They were not a place of interest. But I do look at the mythology and mythos around witchcraft and magic a lot. That's my primary fandom is magic, so that's where I am. And I think a lot about how the concept of witchcraft has been rehabbed and flipped around and remixed so much, and it is consistently being remixed. And I enjoy the level of intention and work that's been done on that. And I would like to see people do more work for that within the Black spaces, because a lot of Black communities are very anti anything related to witchcraft and magic. I feel like a lot of it has, but I think a lot of that is steeped into treatment of West African culture as they were enslaved and human trafficked into this country, and how much backlash they received for bringing their West African culture, and how that was called witchcraft and denominated all these things. And so I would love to see more interrogation of like, how can we own the things that are part of like the cultures that our ancestors came to this country with, and not stigmatize it? And I think that's interrelated with this like Lovecraft colonial racist lens and creating orcs. I feel like, how do we reclaim what was ours to begin with that we were stigmatized out of actually utilizing within our culture?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Now I'd love to open it up to all of you if you have any questions for our brilliant panelists. I see a hand already.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. Thank y'all. Ooh, that's out. Thank you so much. I have so many, you've given me so many places I can go in my reading and watching. One thing I'm thinking about in terms of even Black Nerds Create, there's this other, I don't know the name of the magazine itself, but they have a series of issues, Women of Color, Destroy, Queers Destroy, and it's like Queers Destroy science fiction, Queers Destroy horror. And so one of the things I'm interested in that is I feel like there's a kind of expectation, which I understand, that when we create, we're going to disrupt all of these tropes to the tradition. And sometimes I want to continue them. I think this is the thing, is I deeply love monsters and I love villains. I'm going to root for them over the hero every single time. And I think like Jessica Guest has this fantastic novel, Stork Berserk, where the Black woman gets to occupy exactly that position of villainy. And so I'm just curious to hear a little bit about I don't know, is there a way to love and open up sites of Black villainy and Black monstrosity? They're not redemptive. They're not trying to humanize the monster. I'm kind of tired of seeing all the monsters humanized, to be honest. Yeah. And so I'm just curious to hear about those frontiers, because in a lot of young adult fiction, I do see those wonderful turns where there's something about monstrosity, where there's a humane side I'm supposed to learn. I'm curious if that resonates with your reading interests and creative interests at all.
That is why I recommended I Feed the Beast and the Beast is Me. I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me by Jameson Shea, because there is no redemptive arc. It's literally, I'm going to engage with this creature that gives me magical power. I'm going to keep sacrificing myself to it, and I only care about insofar as much as what I'm getting out of it. I don't care about anything else. I care about one character that I think I'm supposed to care about, but then I realize, do I actually care about them? Like villainy the whole way through, no redemption arc. And I enjoy that in stories because, again, like I said, there's this like entanglement of, and we understand where that comes from, right? Of like, Black women have been portrayed as less than as soon as there's been any portrayal of Black women anywhere. So when it takes a lot to kind of outgrow this like feeling of like, no, we have to like actually show us being nice and likable. And I think that's for women in general, like the likability factor, but I think like it's just been a trope we keep going back to. So I think there's a lot of space for people to be monsters, but I think it's interesting, like you mentioned a book, and also gonna need that rec from you later, where it's been in a book space where we've been seeing a lot more exploration, but not as much in visual media. And I feel like that's because, to an extent, because how much there is probably a selling it kind of thing. Like how are we going to get big studios to buy into a story that does that? Because they're going to say, well, the audience isn't there. Like the audience doesn't want to see a Black villain without a redemption. We can't do that. That's like not PC. And it's like, that's not, if you do it well, right? Yeah, just do.
And if you do it without falling into like specific stereotypes, like you can totally have someone be.
I was going to just say, I have not watched Castlevania, but I do know there's a Black villainy character who is, and so that's my only thing. I know there's like one.
Well, you know what though? I argue this all the time, and it's not monster, but villain. Killmonger from Black Panther, but also to a certain extent, Namor, where the villain or the anti-hero or whatever, they have a logic behind it that doesn't make it right or just, right? Like,
I think Killmonger was.
It's kind of just.
Killmonger was right.
but I do think like I can see where he's coming from, and I can also see where he wildly lost the plot and went off the rails, and I can hold both of those things in tandem and not try to make him a misunderstood anti-hero. No, like the dude wanted revenge. He wanted to re-perpetrate the systems perpetrated against him against those people. But the answer isn't you colonized and brutalized us, and so in return we colonized and brutalized you. If you think about like the Black experience, especially the Black American experience, in my experience, the vast majority of us want to be left alone. Just let us live, right? And like there doesn't ever, in a large sense, you get a gathering of Black people together, and it doesn't turn into like revenge plots and what we would do to them. It's like, imagine a world in which I could go get a coffee. Isn't that lovely, right? And so I do think that like there is a misunderstanding in media comprehension, I guess, or something where like just because your villain makes sense or you can see where they're coming from means that they're no longer a villain. Like sometimes a villain has made a point, or has an ideology that is well thought out, but is wrong or flawed, or you know what I mean? Like evil doesn't have to be senseless, right? So like I do think that these things exist, but the problem then becomes in the reading of those characters, and in the human desire to want redemption. I don't think there's I can argue this until I'm blue. I don't think there's a redemptive arc for Killmonger. I think it's like big, throw me in the ocean with my ancestors who knew that death was. But those aren't your ancestors because they died. Your ancestors are the ones that lived through the horror, the torment to get you here, right? So I think that like a lot of it also falls on the audience and what we're willing to like really hold and like understand as like, yeah, the villain made points, but was still a villain.
I'll just know that those are not protagonists, and that's been a problem too.
Yes.
When do we get the protagonist characters to be?
Who are, yeah.
There's hands. I don't know if there's some like.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here today, and it's been such a pleasure. My initial question was going to ask about horror tropes in Blackness, but then it shifted like immediately once you started talking about orcs, because I love them. I have them tattooed on my skin, and I'm a huge tabletop nerd. So it kind of, I'm curious on y'all's opinions on the recent kind of shift, I feel like, in philosophy of talking about race specifically in tabletop games and fantasy settings, to where even like the concept of race, I feel like, is attempted to be kind of deconstructed in the way that we've set it up kind of contemporarily. I think of like the Pathfinder setting as referring to it as ancestry rather than race, or even the concept in something like Dungeons and Dragons where the alignment system and like the notion of innately evil races is something that we're trying to like move away from, maybe. So how, you know, from your perspectives, I'm curious, the kind of movement away from certain races being innately evil, and even the concept of race in a fantasy setting.
Yeah, so I'm a fantasy writer as well, so it's something I think about a lot when I'm like creating worlds where there are people, you know, different kinds of beings or people with different kinds of magic. Calling it different races is an interesting thing because, you know, we as humans in like the real world, we're different races, but we're all the same species, right? And so one of the things that happens like in Lord of the Rings and in those stories is that they conflate species with race, which is which is not the same. And so I think it makes sense then to shift that phrase into something else like ancestry or being or something like that, just because you can't really like they're not the same, I guess.
I mean, you even think race is a social construct, right? And so there are places in which I remember like learning about apartheid South Africa, and like races are completely different there than they are here. So if race is a social construct and you are working on a tabletop game in which you are socially constructing a world, then you construct it the way in which it makes sense to you. So I think those are, and I'm totally fine with moving away from that as especially like a classification, especially when there are classifications that make much more sense. And
Right.
are,
Or when you can say like, oh, these races or creatures are innately evil versus just like,
Yeah.
you know, this one had a bad day and that one's
Which is more likely to happen, right? Like that was whenever you said that, I was thinking, oh, I can so easily understand how that came to being. Like that, like that's a certain particular lens that says races can be evil and races can be good, and that's probably like it's most likely a white male lens to be like it's a race problem. And it's like no,
Yeah.
like no matter where you go, all people are different. Like I'm an introvert. Well, we're all introverts here.
We're all
But like I'm a Sagittarius, Cancer. You know what I mean? Like there's so many different aspects and personality types, and I think so going back to the idea of like questioning the origin of like why that's there. And it sounds like the tabletop community is in that place of like not only just questioning but pushing and adjusting according to. So I enjoy hearing that, and I think that the class thing and species bothers me to no end. So I'm glad to have this conversation as well.
Can I jump in on this? Am I allowed to? Because I have so many thoughts. I really appreciate you making the point about the conflation of race and species. This frustrates me to no end. And particularly when we think about the fact that, again, in sort of our world among humans, right, all the research that we have shows that there is in fact more genetic variation within these supposed things that we have called racial groups than actually between them. So like there is no basis for them. I think where I get frustrated is sort of the idea that we're still gonna have this mechanic, but we're gonna call it something else. We're not gonna call it race, we'll just call it ancestry. And the reason why is because, so I'm a scholar of Blackness in Europe, right? And in Europe, the language of talking about difference functions quite differently than it does in the US. And part of that has to do with the legacy of World War II and the Holocaust and genocide. And what happened after World War II was this sort of shared understanding that race as a biological category was dangerous, and so we couldn't use it. So we take that out of the lexicon. But here's the thing, racism itself didn't go away.
right.
So the mechanism by which people sort of justify their racism, exclusion, xenophobia, restrictive immigration policy shifts to a language of cultural difference, cultural incompatibility, religious, civilizational incompatibility. Because the underlying process that creates those categories in the first place is racism, not race. And so I think the same logic applies when we talk about tabletop role-playing games, which is that if we're simply changing the name of the mechanic, but not changing what that category actually does in the game, it doesn't matter. And so this is why I'm thinking particularly about The Other Sea, which is this setting that Elizabeth Swenson and Michael Chemers created, in which we get together and play D&D every week. And one of the things that they did was even in the, so, obviously no innate alignments, but also saying that there are no innate ability advantages or disadvantages that come with your, let's say, species or ancestry or whatever. So blowing out of the water the idea that this group that you're categorized within comes with any kind of innate set of traits. So that's my one quibble with the, well, we'll call it this instead of that.
Thank you.
I love that.
Thank you. So I don't remember who said it, I'm sorry, but someone said something that I found very resonant, which was, it's very hard to read something without social connection when you look at the monster in it, and it's clear that that monster is a monsterization of everything about your own culture. Like, it's very hard to escape into Dune if you're a queer person, and the only queer person in Dune is the creepy, grotesquely fat pederast. But I think there's this overwhelming idea that the purpose of genre fiction is escapism. And for marginalized people, it has always been impossible to read genre fiction as escapist. But for people who feel comfortable in their identity within the dominant culture, it's like an assumed fact. And you know, I mean, you see grown men having like screaming tantrums on the internet because someone challenged their idea that maybe actually there is something socially relevant about race in Lord of the Rings. And like, when you are a marginalized person trying to break into genre fiction and trying to create art and culture, which to my mind is, at least the way I think of it, a kind of revolutionary project, a kind of project of transforming and recreating culture. How do you shake a culture out of escapism? How do you convince people that have never seen themselves be the monster that actually you can't not think about social context? Because it's important in my mind that you can't read things without social context. But how do you convince people of that when they've never been the monster?
I think you have to do the work. Like, I think a big problem with like a large amount of genre fiction is that they want to just shortcut. So you know what an orc is. So they'll just say an orc. And they don't describe it. They don't understand, like they don't really talk about like the nuances of how it works in this world that you're building. If you're doing world building, thing I hate about Tolkien, and I don't need 20 pages on this tree. I really don't. I don't care. But if you are trying to like break out of escapism and you're trying to build this world, I forget who it was. I read a book, though, in which every single character was described when they were introduced. It didn't matter. And it wasn't like dark skin, they were all described. If they had white skin, olive skin, whatever. You see so often in fiction and in media where there is a shorthand and they want you to just glean off of what you already know or what has been established or current things. And so if you're going to lean on that, then all of that stuff comes in with it, right? So if you want to write an escapist novel, but you don't want to do the work to describe every character that they come across, describe the way the world works, describe the way the politics in the world work, describe the way that society works, then you can't actually build an escapism, because this is something I say all the time. We might be reading the same book, but we're reading two different stories. Because I'm going to bring in myself into my understanding and reading of the story. You're going to bring yourself into that, and we are different people. So the story changes, right? And our understanding of the story changes. A large flattening of that is when we actually sit down and say, like, it's not foolproof, because I swear to God, in Hunger Games, they described Rue until they were blue in the face.
Like 3 times,
and then the movie came out and people were shocked. So, but it does, you at least then have something to go back to, you know, when the people are shocked that, reading comprehension is a thing. So I think, you can't, if you're gonna lean on people's knowledge or what you assume that they already know, you're inviting in all of the isms that they also already know.
I think you also have to invite people to question what they need to escape. I feel like if we keep let's think about the old established canon. And I say old, I'm sorry, I was born in the 80s, but 80s established canon of sci-fi, right? And those writers use actual racism happening against Black people in the real world to talk about races within their stories. And it's this is escapist to you to imagine yourself being oppressed in the same way people in real life are being oppressed in this day. And that's escapist to you. And you need to really question, why is that an escape for you? Why does that feel like a fantasy setting that you want to be in, but you don't want to interrogate it when it's happening in real life? Really question that. And that's been my big plea for I would love to read older stories, but I'm not going to be able to read it and not be annoyed and frustrated without seeing that lens of you really appropriated an actual oppression and then it's escapist. Yeah. And I think that I've seen a lot of stories today do a better job of if you're going to read it in oppression, it's a story world-based oppression and not a just resequencing of something that's happening in IRL too far, not too far escaped.
So I think we have time. Yeah, we have time for one more question, I think, Michael? Yeah.
I think this last question is kind of related to the comment that I wanted to make, which is when I was a kid, my dad made me watch a lot of blaxploitation films, and I think about films like Blackula. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I felt like that was something.
Into this without.
Yes, but so there was Blackula in the '80s. There were like silly films. I think it was like I don't know, like Something in Compton. I mean, there have been a lot of black films featuring black monsters that are unrepentant that appeared in the '70s and '80s that were directed primarily at a black audience, and I'm just wondering what you all have to say about that. I haven't rewatched the films with my modern way of looking at the world, but I understand what they were attempting to do in that moment, and I think they are worth revisiting.
I'm sorry.
I'll just right away. My godmother, I think I was like 4 or 5. We had a sleepover at her house, and she showed us Blackula, and that is why I don't do monsters now. I'm like, I know that if I were to rewatch it now, I wouldn't have the same like horror factor, but it's seared into my mind.
She talks about
it's why I
Blackula
don't sleep with closet doors open. It's why I'm like terrified of vampires. Like Blackula really just did a number on me as a child. So that's why we had that reaction, because
Blackula comes up a lot in our lives. I've never seen it, but I know that it is the height of horror.
A major trauma.
A major trauma.
Speaking of blaxploitation, oh goodness, I'm trying to think of I'm thinking about like Tales from the Crypt, and isn't
it like Vampires in South Central or something like that?
Something like that. There's something so I think like Tales from the Crypt, for instance, there's something really goofy about the Crypt Keeper, right? And that's I think that's so indicative of black culture, where like we make fun of the thing we're scared about. Like, because what else are we gonna do about it? We have to live through it no matter what we do. So let's just like make a crypt keeper. I don't know if everyone, he looks like a skeleton. He has like rangy like hair, and as like the Tales from the Crypt are happening, it's an anthology series, so there's just different stories happening, and they're all like somewhat interconnected. And I really enjoy that, like the spirit and the energy given behind like these stories being told from like neighborhoods and spaces that are not typically covered in like dominant culture. I think and this is not blaxploitation, but like Candyman, the original one, that was my early like scary movie that like sleepover watched Candyman and play Bloody Mary. That was like the thing that we did. And Candyman, I know it was interesting that like he was one of the early villain characters that I saw in this like morally gray space of like he is getting vengeance, but you don't realize that until like the end of the story basically, and then it like gives you a whole bright new lens to understanding like what is driving this horrific monster. And I think once I had Candyman, I was never interested in Michael Myers. I was never interested in any of the big other creepies, because I'm like, but they don't have a reason. They're just doing it. Like, I get that, like, over time we do get some mythos behind them. By the time I was like, no, they're just doing it. But Candyman, like, vengeance, I can get behind vengeance. Like, that's the story. And I think that's I love the history behind blaxploitation and being able to interrogate things with that, again, comedic but also horrific lens. So there's some, I guess, more stories that we could talk about, like that are comedy horror in that way, that I think are real fun for that. And I think blaxploitation amplified that in the black community in a way that I would love to see more of, like scary movies done in, stuff like that.
Yeah. I think the blackening is like most recent. I didn't get to watch the whole thing, but
it's not as funny though. It's like haha, like
it's definitely it's even more like comedy, but
it's more comedy than horror.
Robyn's like, no,
I don't even know what that is. I don't even know that that's a thing, but I agree with you.
Yeah, I want to see that one.
Isn't Swarm? I don't want to watch that because I don't want Beyonce to be mad at me. But isn't that like supposed
Swarm
to be?
it's like a black female serial killer. But I never watched that one either. I'm very particular about what I can watch. I love horror, but I also don't want nightmares and this like a weird space that I have to navigate. Yeah.
Any last questions?
Last comment or question? Okay.
Yeah, if we have time. Thanks for the panel. It was really great to hear from you. You were talking a little bit earlier about how they're like Disney corporate forces trying to deal with diversity or to bring wokeness into this, and how wonderfully the culture is dealing with that conversation so gracefully. I'm so frustrated because it seems like any time there's a female character, protagonist, hero, woman of color, person of color, queer, trans, whatever it is, right? It's like everybody comes out and they're like, have a lot of problems with character development and storytelling, right? And it's like, I'm not racist, I just don't like bad storytelling. And it's like they all seem to be terribly written characters and stories. So it's obviously kind of ridiculous. But I also kind of wonder whether or not there is a little bit of truth in that, and that the storytelling isn't being handled properly in the writers' rooms and in the corporate committee structure that this stuff is cranked out in, and what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the backlash, it kind of goes back to the conversation about escapism and what is escapism for these people who haven't had to see people of color, and part of that is not seeing us in their stories. I think, there is also something to be said about not hiring the right people to tell those stories. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you're like, oh, y'all really had people in the room, you can tell, and that's always fun and makes it more worthwhile. And other times, we also talk a lot about, especially given COVID and everything, and just wanting more escapist stuff. So picking and choosing what I'm gonna watch with we could call it brain off. I'm just watching it, and then what kinds of things that you can't help, you just can't turn it off. It's going to still pick at you, and it's just sometimes it's hard because sometimes you can tell you're okay, this wasn't done as well as it could have been, but I'm still gonna watch it because I just need the just need the escape. I just need the chill, come down, decompress moment. So, yeah.
You reminded me of a point I was going to make and I forgot. So yes, if escapism for you means not seeing people of color in your world, Sex and the City before they did the revamp, right? Then really interrogate your escapism. But when it comes to the hiring writers that actually can speak to the story that you're trying to tell, I think that's a big thing that's been my question. It's been, what kind of story are you trying to tell? Because if you want to tell a story that's steeped in dominant culture, and so you're hiring people of color as writers, but you only want them to write, and so far the dominant culture is reified and magnified, then you're not going to get the kind of saturation you may be looking for with audience if you're actually looking for an audience that wants to feel represented. So are you actually looking for representation, or are you just trying to check a box? And I think that's where we get caught up a lot in these committee and structural showrunner, who's writing the story, who's hiring people to write the story. They're not examining the lens under which they want to tell the story first. They just want to check a box. I remember recently hearing, while the writer's strike was happening, the CEOs were in a room, and one of them was like, are we still doing diversity? Is that a thing we're still doing? And I think that tells a lot about the characterization and why we do get the floppy, not good storytelling, because they're looking at it as a box. The ones who aren't doing that, we probably are noticing that. The ones that are, we can notice that as well. So I think that's part of the component behind it.
I also think there's a inescapable link between capitalism and racism and all the isms, right? The fact that we've just decided that black movies don't sell overseas. Jordan Peele I don't watch his movies. I bought tickets because I want to support him, but I'm not going. But he's proven that wrong. And I mean, how many times do we have to disprove it before we just stop saying that, right? And
we only need one. Like
Black
Black
Panther.
Panther did well, but Black Panther, the sequel, didn't do as much. So it was that.
But, you know, we take all the black people off of the posters, and then people come into the theater very confused. I think that there is a matter of also just remembering, like, that there is nothing worshipped more in Hollywood than the box office number, and the people, not in the writer's room, not even in the production room, but those like 15 dudes owning the studio and saying things like, we're gonna make them hurt so that the writer's strike and the actor strikes end easily, as if those people are not already bouncing 2 to 3 jobs and have been, and like hurting isn't the reason for the strike in the first place, right? So I think that there is an understanding of decisions being held in the smallest number of hands, and all of those hands look very similar to each other. And so it does, to a certain point, a disservice to act as though if we can just complain about the writer's choices, that's where it ends, right? I don't have a solution, but I just, you know, that's where it comes from. You know, they've decided these things don't sell, no one wants to see this, no one wants to read these movies, and that means that those 15 dudes don't want to see this and they don't want to read those, you know, things, because it's not based in reality.
For them, their reality does not look.
Yeah,
like
their reality does not look like the global majority's reality, obviously. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. Black Nerds Create, thank you so much for being here. We are so happy and thrilled that you could join us, and thank you for responding to me when I wrote to you. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Dr. Hawthorne, for being our interlocutor. Yes, absolutely.